Hello, welcome back to History For. Today we're going to be talking about Queen Elizabeth I, and she was a true character. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she has some really cool stories and really interesting facts about her, and I'm going to tell you 10 of them today. So let's get right into it with fact number 1. Queen Elizabeth I was nearly executed by her sister Mary I. During the White Rebellion that occurred during Elizabeth's sister, Queen Mary I's reign, Mary was imprisoned by Elizabeth in the Tower of London on the 18th of March 1554 when she was just 20 years old. Mary had suspected that her sister Elizabeth was somehow involved in the rebellion and sought to have her interrogated as to her involvement. Queen Mary I has the notorious nickname Bloody Mary for a reason. One can only imagine what was going through Elizabeth's mind as they came to escort her to the Tower. Elizabeth must have been very convincing, as Queen Mary freed her sister from the Tower and placed her instead under house arrest. Hauntingly and probably somewhat calculating on Mary's part, she released Elizabeth from the Tower on the anniversary of her mother Anne Boleyn's execution at that very place. I am sure that Elizabeth knew exactly what Mary was saying when she chose that date for her release. Elizabeth spent a year in house arrest before eventually becoming fully free. Number 2. Interesting circumstances surrounding her death. Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March 1603. Prior to her death, she asked that her inauguration ring be filed from her finger. The ring symbolised her marriage to England, and the removal thereof ended her obligation to the crown and country, signifying her impending death. The ring could not simply be removed as one would normally remove a ring, as it had become so surrounded with flesh it was like it had grown into her body. Another request that she made was that she not be disemboweled upon her death. This was a custom that usually occurred as part of the embalming and preparing a body for burial process. However, upon her death, this request was not granted, and she was in fact disemboweled prior to being placed in her coffin. Her body was not buried for 3 weeks after her death. Her coffin was draped in velvet and watched over by 6 of her ladies. On one particular night, as they were watching over the body, a loud and piercing crack was heard from within the casket as her body exploded from all the gases built up within it. This occurrence also happened with her father, King Henry VIII, although they put his explosion down to his morbid obesity, something that Elizabeth I was not inflicted with. It was said, however, that had she not been disemboweled as she had wished, the explosion could have been so much worse. Can you imagine the Queen's body exploding with so violently that it burst the coffin right open? Especially in the middle of the night. In Elizabeth's case, the explosion of her body only splintered the casket. On the procession to her final resting place, the effigy placed on her coffin was so lifelike that it caused the public to gasp in shock. Number 3. Elizabeth refused to lay down. In her final years, she refused to lay down at all. She would just stand in her bedchamber for up to 15 hours a day before she finally collapsed and they could move her to her bed. Her ladies in waiting were so concerned about her because she wouldn't let anybody help her that they placed pillows around the floor around her so that when she finally fell that she would have a soft landing. And after she fell, she would lay on the ground for about 4 days before they were finally able to get her and convince her to get into bed. It was such an insane ritual that she had, but she was worried that if she lay down in bed that she would never get up again. It's needless to say that in her final years, Elizabeth was suffering both mentally and physically because that is not normal. Number 4. Elizabeth I was the most well-educated English monarch. After her father, King Henry VIII, passed away, she was in the care of his final wife, Catherine Parr, and Catherine Parr had high value of education, and she made sure that Elizabeth received the best education that one could possibly hope for. Elizabeth I was fluent in up to 7 languages, both in reading, writing, and speaking, which is absolutely insane. I think they call those people like polylinguals or something like that. Polyglot, that's what they're called. But it is just insane to think that somebody can speak that many languages. She was also well versed in public speaking. She had the most insane education that one could possibly hope for, and that served her so well as a queen because she didn't need to rely on other people for their wisdom and their intellect, because she had all that wisdom herself and she could make decisions for herself based on what she knew and what she understood. And that was such a huge blessing to her that her stepmother Catherine Parr gave to her. Number 5. She had her cousin executed. During her reign, she had her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, in prison for 18 years before finally having her executed. Mary was the daughter of her father, King Henry VIII's sister. Mary became the Queen of Scotland at only a few days old on her father's death. However, she was sent to France to be raised in the court of King Henry II. She eventually married his son and became queen consort to France. Her husband's death sent her back to Scotland, where she sat on the throne to rule. Unfortunately, she ended up having to seek refuge in England. It was here that Elizabeth imprisoned her in various castles. Mary, Queen of Scots, felt that she was somewhat entitled to England's throne as well. She believed that Elizabeth was not eligible to be the queen, as her mother Anne Boleyn was executed by her father King Henry VIII, and their marriage declared as illegitimate, therefore making Elizabeth an illegitimate child not entitled to reign. This threat to her reign was what caused Elizabeth to have her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, executed. However, on her deathbed, Queen Elizabeth I said that she never actually authorised for her cousin to be executed, and she had so much guilt over that, which I find is quite interesting. Who authorised it if it wasn't Elizabeth? Or did she authorise it and she just felt so guilty that she didn't really want to admit it? I don't know. I guess we will never know really what happened. Number 6, Elizabeth refuses to get married. No matter what the government tried to do, she refused to get married. They had many suitors, lots of people asked for her hand in marriage, but she just said, nope, I am not getting married, and she was pretty adamant about it. Elizabeth maintained that she was married to her country. It is really no wonder that she refused to marry. She saw what marriage had done in her own family, particularly with what happened to her mother. Marrying would put her at risk, and she was safer, and the throne was safer if she remained to rule alone. Her refusal to marry also meant that she did not produce an heir to the throne. Even on her deathbed, she did not name a bed. However, before she died, she did give her blessing for King James to become the next king after her, to be her heir. And James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and he was the current king of Scotland. So then he became the king of Scotland and the king of England, which is quite interesting. I wonder if her feeling guilty about murdering his mother or executing his mother had something to do with her blessing that she gave him to follow her as ruler. Elizabeth I is also said to actually have had many lovers, so whether she was a virgin or not, we may never know. Number 7, her wardrobe was absolutely insane. She loved fashion, and from a very young age she just was the fashion queen, I guess. And there's even like a whole fashion period named after her, the Elizabethan period. And she was well known for her manner of dress. Elizabeth had a wardrobe that was beyond anything you could even dream of. It is said at the end of her reign she had amassed over 2,000 dresses. Even as a little girl, her mother Anne Boleyn was known for providing her with an excessive wardrobe, far more extensive than her older sister Mary's was at the time. Unfortunately, once her mother was executed, those dresses became few and far between. At one point, they actually had to beg the king for money in order to buy her new clothing, as she had outgrown all the dresses that her mother had provided her before her death. It is no exaggeration to say that she was likely the fashionista from the start. Her love of fashion was well known, and upon any notable occasion she was lavish with gifts of clothing and jewellery to add to her growing wardrobe. In 1587 there was an inventory taken of Elizabeth I's jewellery, and the total therein was 628 pieces. She would, no doubt, continue to add more and more to that over the years. Elizabeth I absolutely appreciated style, and she expected everyone around her to dress to the nines. And there's a story that is told where one of her courtiers was not dressed appropriately for her standards, and she didn't like what he was wearing, so she threw a shoe at him and spat at him, which I think is just rude, firstly, but I think, oh my goodness, imagine what, like, the pressure of having to pick what you're going to wear every morning. I find it hard enough as it is without the pressure of maybe the Queen's going to spit at me or throw her shoes at me, I don't know. Okay, moving on to number 8. This one is a little ludicrous, but we will go with it. Queen Elizabeth I was actually a boy. There is some evidence to suggest it, but it's really a bit far-fetched and probably not entirely true at all, but it is an interesting theory nonetheless that pops up time and time again. The theory is that Queen Elizabeth I died when she was a young child, and her governess was so terrified to tell Henry VIII that she went out looking for another little girl that she could replace Elizabeth with. And she couldn't find one, but what she did find was a little boy with red hair that would match her perfectly. And so they buried Princess Elizabeth at the time, and they got this other little boy, and they pretended that he was going to be Elizabeth, and that was the true reason that Elizabeth never married. The evidence comes from that when they went back to this town where this little boy was supposedly found, that there was a little girl buried, about a young girl who would have been about Elizabeth's age, I guess, when she was supposed to have passed away, buried in a stone tomb, and she was wearing some clothes like Elizabeth would have worn. They say that nobody ever told King Henry at all because they were so scared of what he might do that he might like execute them or something. So everybody who did know about it were very, very hush hush, and they just didn't say anything. So that was how the secret was able to be kept well hidden, and that is the real reason why she never married, because she didn't want anybody to find out that she was actually a man. I guess you're just going to have to make up your own mind on that one. Now, moving on to number 9, Queen Elizabeth I almost married her sister's husband. Her sister was married to King Philip, and her sister Queen Mary actually passed away while she was married to King Philip, and he proposed marriage to Queen Elizabeth. King Philip II was a king of Spain, and he desperately wanted to marry an English queen. Such a marriage would be politically advantageous for him. He ended up marrying Elizabeth's sister Mary I. The public was in absolute uproar about this marriage. For Mary though, she thought that she was marrying for love, but the truth was that Philip was really just marrying her for power. He was not yet the king of Spain at the time, but marrying Mary made him king consort of England. Mary believed herself to be pregnant and declared that upon the birth of the child, if she were to die, that Philip would reign while that child was in infancy until they could reasonably take over the throne. Unfortunately, no child was born, and Mary died not long after of what is thought to be ovarian cancer or something similar. After Mary's death, Philip proposed marriage to Elizabeth, who was now the reigning monarch. She turned him down, as she did all other suitors. This is probably one proposal that the government was super happy that she turned down, because they did not want him to be ruling, because he was Catholic and they didn't want a Catholic on the throne. And Elizabeth I, she was Protestant, so it would have been a little touchy, I think. She didn't want to marry him anyway. Finally, number 10, Elizabeth I almost didn't become queen at all. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was King Henry VIII's second wife. When Elizabeth was just a little girl, he had Anne executed for treason and incest, both convictions that she was later found to be innocent of. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, Henry VIII in turn proclaimed his marriage to her mother illegitimate, also making Elizabeth a bastard child. She was promptly removed from the line of succession, as was her sister Mary I, who was Henry VIII's oldest child and daughter from his first marriage. Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, tried to have both Mary and Elizabeth reinstated as rightful heirs, but was unsuccessful. It was not until his final wife, Catherine Parr, came along that Henry at last put both Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession. Had he not done that, they may very well have not made it to the throne at all, and we would be looking at a very, very different history book. So there we have the 10 facts about Queen Elizabeth I. I think they were quite interesting, and I really enjoyed learning about her because she is such a fascinating woman. And the fact that was most interesting to me was how her body exploded. I think that is kind of hilarious. I don't know if that is like politically correct to say or anything, but I think it was hilarious. Can you imagine like being one of her ladies in waiting, like her ladies' maids, and protecting her coffin and stuff? Because this happened at night, and you're just standing around, and all of a sudden the coffin just explodes. That would scar me for life. I would not be able to deal with like any kind of death or anything like that. I would be like running for the hills. There would be no way that you could keep me in that chapel or wherever the coffin was held. Imagine if she wasn't disemboweled, like how much more gases and stuff, like would her body have like exploded the whole coffin? Oh my gosh, can you just imagine that? Just think about that for a minute. Terrifying. And also like the effigy that they put on the coffin was so lifelike that it scared like all the public because it was just too real. I hope you enjoyed that, because Queen Elizabeth is quite the lady. She had her good points and she had her bad points, but nonetheless she is a very interesting lady, and she was the last Tudor to reign, and that makes her a bit special as well. And I leave this with you today, and I hope you come back next time.